Sean. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Clarinet Connections. Once again, I'm so happy today to see you all, and I know it takes a minute for everyone to log in. I would like to introduce our special guest today, which is Sean Perrin. You've already had the pleasure of seeing Sean at a few of our Clarinet Connections sessions so far, but today he is our special guest. And I want to do a little bit of an introduction to Sean. He is the host of the Clarinet podcast, and we're going to hear a lot more about that today. But I was reflecting, if you have been enjoying every day, hearing interviews with great clarinetists here through the Clarinet Connections Festival, that's what the Clarinet podcast is all about. And if you enjoyed this, you can download many episodes and kind of carry on with your clarinet learning thanks to everything that Sean has created with the Clarinet podcast. So as you're logging on, please let us know where you're from. You can say hello. If you have questions for Sean and you're in Zoom, please feel free to put them in the question and answer box, and we'll have time to take a look at your questions later in our session. So great to have you all here. Sean, so happy to have you as a guest. And I think many people listening are familiar with the Clarinet podcast, but in case they're not, can you just give us a little bit of the history of it, the story, how you created it, what it is, how people can access it? And I'd love to just hear your version of how this all came about.
For sure, yes. Yeah. So there's kind of like a long story and also a short story. So maybe I'll tell them both, but in reverse order here. So the short story is the Clarinet podcast is a podcast that's available for free on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you happen to get your podcasts, or on the website at clarinet.com. And the show features, I say at the beginning, all that's new and neat for clarinet with the neatest people in the industry. And that was really my goal from the beginning, was to talk to just people who don't have a platform on, big name news shows, or you don't turn on the TV and see your favorite clarinetist every day. So 5 years ago, when I first came up with this concept, it was kind of like just a way to give a platform to clarinetists that I wanted to hear about, and I wasn't able to find a place that was happening at all. So the more long version of that story is that it actually came out of sort of a need, because I had been personally looking for a clarinet podcast and had been unable to find one for a couple of years actually. And one day I was talking to my repair tech on the phone, whose name is Peter Spriggs at the time. You might know who that is, I would assume. He's also in British Columbia. But I just realized that the conversation we were having was exactly the kind of conversation that I actually wanted to be listening to. We were just kind of going off about various things and his past teachers and past clients and funny stories and stuff like that. And that's kind of what started it off, as I realized that was probably something that other people would want to tune in on. And it kind of emerged from there with a few more steps along the way, which we can talk about if you want.
That sounds great. So really nobody was doing anything like this. You saw the void there and you decided to step in. So did you have any idea how to run a podcast when you started this whole process?
My only experience with podcasting at the beginning was the fact that I'd listened to tons of podcasts. It's funny because there was one a long time ago when I was listening. I can't remember what it's called right now. Something about Grammar Girl, maybe. I don't know why I would listen to this show, but I just remember being really interested that she had this platform to talk about something as crazy as grammar. And I was like, how is there a following for talking about grammar? But later when I came up with the idea for Clarinet, it sort of gave me the confidence to launch it, because I was like, well, if there's a podcast about grammar, then surely there's a podcast that could be about the clarinet, right? And one of the criticisms at the beginning, actually, that some of my friends were talking about was, how are you going to have a whole show about clarinet that you're going to run out of ideas after 2 months? It's going to be ridiculous. No one wants to listen to that. Or how could you talk to enough people to make that interesting? And the funny thing is, I have so many guest requests and things coming in that I can't possibly keep up with them all. And I still, after 5 years, feel like I'm just at the tip of the iceberg of people to talk to and different ideas and things like that. So it's really been interesting to do. But no, I had no experience podcasting, but I did have a lot of technical experience as far as recording and working with audio programs. But I really did open a can of worms that I couldn't close once I started. It was just so much to do, so much to learn. But the biggest thing I guess I found out is that anybody can really start a podcast. You don't really need a lot of advanced technology, which is one kind of mistake I made at the beginning. I, like a lot of people, started obsessing over microphones and interfaces and software programs and blah, 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 blah. But what it really comes down to is creating good content. And for me, what that meant I needed to do after listening back to the first few interviews, which to this day I find quite embarrassing, to be quite honest. But it was a lot of learning curve about how to conduct an interview, how to talk to someone in an interesting way, how to frame questions, and how to get interesting things out of them without presenting your own bias too much. And that's kind of the interview style that I've preferred to take on. I know that a lot of other people, for example, you're watching Jimmy Fallon or something, there's maybe a little bit more of that person's personality in there, but that's something I've played with for a while, and I actually struggled to insert more of my personality into the show, and whether that's worked or not remains up to the listeners, I guess. But it originally was not supposed to be about me. I kind of intended to be, I don't know, just kind of a voice guiding the conversation, but I think a two-sided thing works pretty well too, so.
I think after 5 years, I'm sure you've, first of all, developed a lot of experience as a host, and I think your own personality probably does put your own spin on it and makes it a really engaging and entertaining program for people to listen to. There might be some people who don't even really know what a podcast is. Do you want to just kind of define it and how one would access it?
Yeah, sure. So it's funny now because definitely in 2016, podcasts were not new. I think they've been around since about 2007, but basically there's something that you take with you on your iPod back in the day, because the term podcast comes from the word iPod, and they were basically radio broadcasts that you could load onto your iPod. Now, this was in the days when things like YouTube were just launching and nobody had a smartphone. But fast forward a few years, so the Clarinet podcast is available on those so-called podcasting platforms. And what you do is you go on your smartphone or your computer, and you would go to some kind of podcasting app, which let me just unlock my phone here. Find it, there it is. So you actually can go in and find your podcasts here. And there's how it looks on the player. So you can select the episodes you want to listen to or don't want to listen to. And that's one of the nice things too, is no one's forcing you to listen to an episode of the podcast ever. So it's not like you turn on the radio and you're kind of just stuck there for the hour until the next show comes on. If you don't like the guest or you're not interested in the topic, you don't really have to tune into that one. You could skip it. And I guarantee that a lot of people listening actually choose which episodes they listen to. And that's one of the reasons I don't mind kind of going off in the weeds and talking to someone about Instagram one week and then maybe about, klezmer and what it's like to live in New York and be a composer the second week. And because people can really come in and out as they wish. And one interesting thing about podcasts too is the content is what they call evergreen. So you could listen to the radio broadcast or the podcast, unlike a radio broadcast, at any time. So you could go back today and listen to every episode that's come out since the very beginning. And every episode is still actually being listened to every month. Every month, at least one person listens to every single episode of the show, which is something that can't be said for radio. If you talked on a radio program 5 years ago, no one's still listening to that program. It's over unless they taped it. So, but it's an audio platform.
I think it's really a wonderful platform. Like the radio, it's something that people can absorb while they're doing other things. Some people listen to podcasts while they're exercising, some people while they're driving in a car. But I think it's really nice to be able to educate ourselves while we're doing things where we would normally be listening to the radio and choosing our content. I know you do.
One thing here, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
That is totally what they're great for. And it's been interesting because I was not sure to expect a peak in downloads or a drop in downloads over the pandemic here. And I think, interestingly enough, because people are commuting less, there has been fewer downloads. And I think that that's actually, in some ways, it's probably the only online content that has been negatively affected. So I've been trying some video interviews and things like that, and to work with it as well. But I see some people in the chat saying they're excited to tune in and check it out. My only thing that I would ask you is I beg you, start at the newest episodes. Don't start at the oldest episodes. It's not like a book. This is not Serial, the podcast. So you're probably going to have a better listening experience starting at the more recent ones, because I've grown a lot as a podcaster. But you know what? Go back and check some of it out, and I welcome you to do that. But I would start at episode 133 instead of number 1, if it were me.
I think that's great advice. Now, I know you do kind of, because podcasting has great stats, you can see how many times people have tuned into an episode and which episodes are popular. And I know sometimes you'll do an episode where you'll say, hey, here were the 5 most popular things in the last year, and you kind of revisit the highlights of it for people. And that's actually a good starting place for people as well, some of those episodes.
Yeah.
What would you, so I have 2 different questions for you, and maybe some of these have the same answers. I'm curious what some of the most memorable ones were for you as an interviewer. Maybe I'll make that the first question.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And you know, it's funny because I actually have memorable moments from talking to all the guests. And one of the things I've loved about actually doing the podcast is I feel like I've developed a positive relationship with a lot of people, and it's in a very positive light. They feel that they have a platform to talk about what they do that they otherwise wouldn't have. And I almost feel like I have a friend every time I talk to a new person. And that's proved to me when I go to somewhere like Clarinet Fest and I just am encountering dozens of people who I feel like I have a connection with, and that's really nice. So some memorable guests though, I mean, I remember back in the very beginning, I started contacting people, and I dreamed that I would one day get to talk to Martin Frost. But I was like, oh, there's no way that's going to happen. And amazingly, I don't know how this occurred, but I ended up getting him on by episode 9, which was really crazy. And my only regret with that one was actually, I think it was too soon. There was some audio issues and my interview style wasn't quite right yet. But you know what? We had a great conversation. It was fun to talk with him. I remember it was his daughter's birthday that day that I had called him, and she was trying to get on the laptop the whole time, and it was her birthday, so she felt like she should be able to do that. And we were having the interview, so it was pretty funny. But he was just a real person. That's one of the things that blew me away, is that all these people in any industry really that you consider to be almost on a pedestal sometimes, they're real people you can talk to. And I think that's one thing that's changed as I've evolved as an interviewer too, is I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but I'm less starstruck when I talk to people now, and I try and have a real conversation with them, if that makes any sense. Although I still definitely revere what they do. Another one that really kind of just comes to mind right away is Stanley Drucker, because I remember when I was in university, probably like 2005 or 6, I got a copy of his the Corelliano Clarinet Concerto, conducted by, I think it's Zubin Mehta, and New York Phil, obviously. And I remember listening to that and just being like, wow, this is such a crazy recording. And this guy is such a legend. And he's, played with everyone, and this, Bernstein, and he's worked with Glenn Gould and seen all these people. And it would be so cool to one day have him sign this copy of the CD or get to meet him or something. But I never thought it would happen. And not only did it happen, but the podcast got to the point where after a year or two, I didn't stop reaching out to guests, but guests would start reaching out to me, and they would be bigger names. And so eventually someone from Stanley Drucker's circle of agents named Jerry Bunke, who does some of the recordings for him, he had reached out to me to get Stanley on the podcast, which I thought was just amazing. So not only did I get to talk to Stanley, I think I've done it 3 times now. I've actually got to talk to his wife, who's also a fantastic clarinet player, wonderful lady. And I've met him at Clarinet Fest. We've had some great conversation, and I was really amazed he never did sign my CD, but he sent me copies of his latest discs, and I was super amazed and really honored to be included actually in the liner notes of his latest CD set as someone who contributed to his career, which to me is much better than and he signed that CD set for me. So to me, that's like I can't even believe that's happened, that I would appear in the liner notes of an artist of that caliber. So there's been a lot of really cool connections, and Stanley Drucker, for example, being, I would consider, one of the greatest living musicians. To have people like this that I know and have had conversations with, it's been quite a trip.
I think it's also a testament to a lot of musicians in the clarinet world, even if they're very accomplished and maybe considered famous clarinetists, are very down-to-earth, generous people. Mm-hmm. I think that's a stereotype of clarinetists, but I'm finding that to be true.
Well, I think that's one thing people like about the podcast. I don't mean to denigrate myself, but I don't have an orchestral job. I'm not a world-class soloist. People before this didn't really know who I was, and I think that allows people to be more relatable to me, or more related to me in that sense. Like I don't want to say I'm just some guy, but like I am probably having the same interests and questions as a lot of people would have. And so ironically, the thing that makes me kind of so much the same as many other people is what makes me stand out, if that makes sense. as an interviewer. I've even seen since the Clarinet podcast is launched, there's been other attempts at various podcasts and things. But I think that, and it's great, everyone's welcome to obviously have as many conversations as they want and broadcast them however they please. But I think that Clarinet still kind of rings true in the sense that it kind of gives a certain perspective. And I open the door to anyone else who wants to have conversations and podcasts and things too, because I think that part of listening to a radio show is hearing the conversation between the hosts. Like, just because someone's been on Jimmy Fallon doesn't mean they couldn't be on David Letterman, and they might as well be on all those shows actually, right? So, but yeah, I think that the spin that's put on it and maybe the character of the conversation, people can come to expect a certain level of I don't want to say quality, but maybe that's the word.
Well, and let me ask you something, Sean, because you are very humble, and I agree with you that you have a knack for asking the questions that you imagine your typical listener would want to ask. And so when you have that opportunity to have somebody with a lot of experience and interest, you ask really good questions. And so I think people who are fans of the podcast knew you as kind of the person who's channeling the questions they have in their own mind. But
Yeah.
just for a moment to kind of turn the spotlight on you, even though you're not playing in an orchestra, you have quite an accomplished performing career and teaching career and other professional things you do. And I just think it might be interesting to those listening to hear a little bit about that aspect of you as a clarinetist, because those experiences probably enhance your ability to host the podcast so well.
Yeah, of course. I think that one thing that makes the podcast interesting is that it is hosted by a clarinetist. Like, I do know the lingo, of course. And a lot of times I find one of the disappointments when I listen to a lot of music interviews is it's obvious that that person is not playing that instrument. So even you listen to, or that they have no experience with that kind of thing. I mean, I even listen to interviews for some of my favorite rock artists. Like, obviously, I'm always talking about Radiohead. I'm a huge fan, but I listen to conversations with someone in Tom York, who's the lead singer, and they never ask him any questions about song form or how he came to that idea or anything that I would find interesting as a musician. It's always just honestly pretty ridiculous questions. And so I try to put not an intellectual spin on the podcast, but like clarinet-based questions that are interesting to clarinetists a lot of the time, right? So, but me as a history, I guess, so it depends how far back we want to go. I mean, I was in school band like everybody else. When I was about 12, I think I started clarinet. No fancy reasons for picking it. My friend next to me, his grandfather had a clarinet that he'd given to him. And we were in school one day and we had the chance to try a bunch of instruments. And I tried the clarinet and the flute and the euphonium. And so I actually liked the euphonium a lot. I thought it was pretty cool. And it was the only instrument I was really able to make a sound on. So I went home and I told my parents, like, look, I think I'm going to play euphonium. And my mom was like, you're not going to play that. I don't even know what that is. But we have a flute. You're going to play flute. And my dad was like, you're not going to play flute. That's a girl's instrument. And I was like, well, maybe I'll play clarinet because my friend Michael has a clarinet and it'd be fun to sit next to him. So that's how I got into it, actually. And we had a lot of fun. There was about 4 or 5 of us who were kind of close friends and throughout band. And people dropped out as the years went on, and I stuck with it. But interestingly enough, in grade 8, I remember very vividly seeing a bass clarinet and thinking it was probably the coolest thing ever because I don't know, it just really was cool. But I actually also saw percussionists, and I thought to myself, wow, that would be the coolest instrument to play. And I ended up actually doing both. So I have played professionally on percussion. Many people probably wouldn't know that, but I've subbed professionally on percussion in quite a few instances. In a lot of different situations. I've played everything from marimba to crash cymbals and bass drum. And actually, I was told that I have quite finesse with crash cymbals at one time by a conductor, which is it's actually very hard to play well. But I've done a lot of percussion work too, and I played snare drum in marching band of all things. So anyways, back to clarinet. I kind of continued both instruments, and I think my parents must have been driven nuts by the sheer level of practice I was doing as a kid. I mean, between drum set and marching snare drum and altissimo high notes at 10 p.m. on the weekends. I mean, God bless our neighbors, I guess. But yeah, I don't know. And that sort of interest in music just continued. I couldn't stop listening to music and learning about it. And so I decided to do an undergrad, which I did at U of C in Calgary here, with Steve Amsel, who is the principal clarinet of the orchestra here. And as I went through my degree, I became really more interested in non-typical repertoire. So I was planning pieces that my teacher had never really heard before, or never studied seriously, because, you know, as an older generation player, I mean, he was mostly playing things like the Mozart and the Weber and, you know, Brahms, and not that I didn't play any of that stuff. I mean, I did actually play Brahms on my senior recital, but I also took an interest in things like Elliott Carter's Gras. I recorded all my own parts for New York Counterpoint, played that one time, a lot of different pieces. And I took an interest early on in releasing things on YouTube too, which was kind of an odd thing to be doing back in 2005 because it had just come out. But anyway, so I did my degree, and at the very end of my degree, they had a program called the Protégé program, which was unique to our orchestra at the time in the city for a professional orchestra. But what it was is you would audition for a panel, and then they would determine whether or not you were of the caliber to come and kind of rehearse with the orchestra members. But what happened is I went there to the rehearsals, and I had a great time. We were playing Holst Planets and a couple other things. And the second player, whose part I was playing with her, she became ill just before the concert. And so they said to me, look, I mean, we could get a sub, but if you can join the union by the end of the week, I mean, you've been here for the rehearsals, it sounds fine. Why don't you just play the gig? And so I was like over the moon excited. And so I did that. And I got the chance to not only play dozens of times over the next several years with the local orchestra, but I've recorded 2 or 3 CD projects with them. And I'm not a member of the orchestra, but I've been on the sub list for quite some time, and have played a lot of things from Firebird to Planets to pop shows that are actually quite fun sometimes. And yeah, so and in 2015, the culmination of a lot of kind of goals that I've ever had was to record a CD project. And so I had to grant funding from the Alberta Foundation of the Arts to record that with a local percussionist. I actually played some percussion on the CD as well. But it was my own arrangements of some pieces by Chick Corea called Children's Songs. And that's available on iTunes and Google Play and all those kind of things. But unfortunately, the next year, I hurt my hand really badly and have kind of been struggling ever since with that. So things are kind of, feel like they're on hold sometimes, but going other places at other times. So that's the story.
You know, I love that you have explored many different channels with your music, and we actually had some comments on your artist page, people wondering about your hand injury and that journey, and I think it's one that a lot of musicians go through at various times. Curious kind of where you are in that path to recovery, and maybe how you've expressed yourself in other ways musically when you weren't able to perform as much.
Yeah, you know, it feels like so little time has passed, because that happened in 2016, and it was right at the beginning of the year. I believe it was 2016, but it was right at the beginning of when I started the podcast. I'd been doing it for only a few months, and I had this happen. So everything was put on hold for a while. I couldn't type. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't play, of course. It was horrible accident. I guess for those who don't know, I fell down the stairs with a glass in my right hand. I was holding it like this, and it got caught and the glass shattered, and I went into the freshly cut glass and severed basically 3 tendons on the top. So these 3 fingers here, there's some scarring still. This middle finger is still kind of screwed up, as you could say. It still aches and is a lot of pain actually to this day. But it was not treated medically properly. Unfortunately, there was some, I don't want to get into it, but there was just some, I almost want to say malpractice, but it was not effectively treated. And I decided to decline surgery, which allegedly could fix it, but they thought might also lead to more scarring. So I have a lot of issues with kind of control of that finger and pain and that kind of thing. But, you know, what it ended up doing for me in a way was it caused me to sort of reconsider the path that I was on. I was never really sure what I wanted to be doing. And now that playing wasn't really an option, in some ways it kind of cleared things up a bit, because, you know, when you've committed to an instrument in the sense that I had for such a long time, you really don't want to just stop. You want to keep trying to achieve that original goal. But when that option is taken away, all of a sudden other things become available. And I realized that I had a lot of strength in computers and sales and online content creation and things like that. And so basically during that time, I started really working on the podcast when I was able to again, and focusing on some of my local teaching that I've been doing and continuing to grow that. And eventually that led to me considering a job that came up with Bakun, which has been really interesting for me because I do have a lot of sales experience from when I was in university. And I was playing, I'd come across one of their products and been kind of amazed with it earlier that year. And it just kind of is a really good fit. I get to work from home, which allows me to still do the podcast, although to a lesser degree, because now we also have a daughter, so things are pretty busy. I'm keeping up as much as I can. But yeah, it's been a very interesting job. I've taken that to be it's a full-time endeavor now. And I would be playing more, but I've chosen to, and teaching, but I actually chose this year to stop teaching and playing entirely, to focus on content development and my work with Bakun and raising my daughter, and kind of just taking I call it a sabbatical, taking some time off of that life for a little while to kind of focus on some other things. But I still have my Clarinet right here, and yeah, it's been very interesting. I like the trajectory that things have gone, and it's one of those things, like, even though it was a horrible accident, I don't know that I'd change anything going back, because it caused me to really change directions, and even with my daughter, like, I'm not sure we would have settled down and had a kid at that time, but it just seemed right. So, and everything's been, you never know how things are going to turn out, I guess.
Oh, that's great. There are some people asking questions, and those of you who are watching, feel free to type in your questions for Sean. I wonder if I can just fire some your way, Sean.
Let's do it.
So here's an interesting one. This is from Clarinet. Clarinet says, I'd love to know more about how you learned to ask questions.
That is a great question.
See,
So I think you already know the answer, because that was such a good question. I'm just kidding. You know, that is something that I realized listening back to the first few episodes of the podcast. I was having questions pop into my head that I hadn't asked at the time. And I was like, well, why didn't I ask that? And the answer is because you have to train yourself to think that way. And you have to train yourself to listen to what someone's saying in a very attentive and musical way, if that makes sense. And this is actually why I think that musical training is so valuable. Even though, for example, I'm not playing an orchestra currently, I still use my musical training every day when editing the podcast, when listening to people talk, when making sure the room is quiet before starting. Like, you can hear, as a musician, you hear all these things. And so when someone's talking and you're having a normal conversation at the bar, for example, usually you're thinking about what you're going to say next. And when I started interviewing, it was the same thing. Like, okay, there's going to be a silence and I'm going to have to speak. What am I going to say? And it started being less about that and more about, where can I lead the conversation? How can I listen but still be mindful of the next thing I'm going to say? And so there's actually a really good book, if you're interested in it, called The Art of the Interview by Martin Perlich. And he was, or is, I'm not sure if he's still living, but he is an excellent interviewer who is a music critic, I believe. And he has interviewed everyone from Leonard Bernstein to Frank Zappa and everyone in between, really. And he just shared his tips on interviewing. It's a little tiny book. You can read it in an afternoon. And it really kind of changed my approach to interviewing. There's a few things I disagree with. One of them being, he always talks about making sure to get the big questions out of the way, because you never know when the interview might suddenly come to an end. And that's happened to me before, like internet gets cut off, or maybe like recently I had a guest, a rather famous interviewer for my other podcast, actually. He came on to talk to me, and usually I can push the time a bit, but he had exactly 43 minutes. And so I didn't get through everything, and I wish I'd kind of framed that one differently and had more of a chance to talk with him. But generally, his advice in that book is extremely good, and I would highly recommend it to anyone interested in learning about how to conduct an interview, how to be a good interviewer, and understanding the medium as well. A big thing about interviewing, which I now incorporate, is at the beginning I say, look, there might be awkward silences. I mean, or we might. I might reframe something, or if you say something wrong, even, you can say it again, because this is an edited program. And that's one of the things that I think really makes Clarinet stand apart too, is the fact that it's not just a conversation that I have and then throw out there most of the time. I mean, sometimes, depending on the context it is, but I actually pay an editor to go through and edit the show. He does a great job. And I do that for reasons of being concise and for just to make it sound more professional. And it's not that I'm trying to change the context of anything that's happening, but I find that a lot of times someone is saying something and it takes them a couple tries before they really get out what they wanted to say. And the previous stuff potentially didn't even matter. But so what might happen is, I mean, someone's talking and I need to take a moment to think about what's happening. So there's dead air, which again is kind of unique to the podcasting medium because you can't deal with dead air on the radio. So you're always speaking. Someone's always speaking. But in a podcast, you can have gaps in the audio that are later edited out. So if I had to sit down and think of a question to ask next, or write something down, or make note of something, I mean, there's that chance to do that. Or even if the guest, wants to say something over, like, oh, I said the date wrong on that. Do you mind if I say that sentence again? It's like, sure, yeah, let's chop that out. And I think that that's a really thing, is to consider your medium, right? And I have found this, honestly, that's why I'm enjoying this session actually, and the other ones I've been a part of here, Michelle. I've really had fun with this because video is new to me. I'm not used to talking in a way like this that's not going to be edited later. So it's been, there's a lot of challenges too. I mean, a lot of questions are coming in on the side here. That's not something I have happening normally when I'm chatting with the guests on the phone. So I mean, maybe it'd be nice, but it's kind of, there's a lot going on, right? Someone has to keep track of all that. So anyways, I hope that answers your question in a long form way, whoever that was.
No, that sounds great. And you know what? I will put that book on the reference page when we have our replay later. Michael was asking, can you spell the name of that author, Martin Perlich?
Martin Perlich.
Do you know it? If not, we can look it up and we'll put it. Oh, you're writing it down. Perlich. Thank you. All right. So next question comes from Kristen. She says, how many episodes of Clarinet Podcast have you made today?
So there's 134 released, I believed, and there's about 20 that are on kind of in the can, so to speak, that need to come out. So there's now probably around 150 that are existing, although only 134 are public.
So if someone was binge listening, it would still take them a few weeks to get through everything.
Yeah, and sometimes they're only about 30 minutes long. That ranges from all the way to over an hour and a half. So I think we're getting to the point where if you put the podcast on at the beginning of the week, I think it might actually go through the entire week, 24 hours a day, until you would stop listening, which is a pretty long time.
Maybe we can have a Clarinet marathon special week fundraiser. All right, that sounds great. Mel is saying, is there some kind of search tool that they can search a particular idea and see which episode it turns up in?
I would love that. And that's actually something that another podcaster I know has done. He basically hired someone to go through. He has a show called Contrabass Conversations. Excellent as well. You should check it out if you're interested. It's about double bass though, so maybe not that relevant. But he had someone go through, and let's say they're talking about bows or rosin or orchestral playing or auditions. Someone would notate the timestamp, and he did that for all 1,000 of his episodes. So he ended up actually making a book out of it because he's assembled the content in such a way that it's like, these are all the comments about orchestral auditions with some of his commentary. So that's one of my long-term goals with the show, is to actually have done something similar. It would help me too when I assemble my best moments of the year kind of episodes, because one of the hardest parts about doing those is going back and listening to 50 episodes, let's say, and figuring out which moments were the best. But I would love it if it was possible to search for, like, this was talking about reeds, or this was talking about hygiene or orchestral playing, but it's currently not possible. So if someone wants to volunteer to go through and make me a spreadsheet of all the episodes, I'd love that. But it's not something I've had the time to do. I find that producing the show is actually really hard to keep up with as it is. And so going back and worrying about what happened on episode 13 is often, it's unfortunate that it's often a back burner thing, because I know people are always listening, people are always interested, but it's just unfortunately not feasible to keep track of 135 episodes and exactly what happened at every moment. And, I used to do a lot of work on the show notes pages. I used to actually have a volunteer who would produce the show notes pages for me, but I found out through an internet poll that like 90% of people didn't ever read the show notes page. And to be fair, I don't think I listen to podcasts and then go to the website of the podcast ever either. So it kind of made sense. But yeah, so the short answer is no. Unfortunately, you can't search by that. Although Apple Podcasts has apparently just released a means to search the spoken word, like they're recording the spoken word and dictating it. So if you were to search, like, I haven't tried this, but if you were to search clarinet ligatures or something, it's possible that Apple Podcasts might pull out episodes that I've discussed that with. I should try that later and see if it works.
I was going to say there are similar technologies now coming out where you can put a video in and it will generate a transcript with timestamps. So if you and I were talking and we put this video in there, we could say Clarinet Reads and it would show up. Here it was at 2 minutes and 20 seconds, and here it was at 15 minutes. But the technology, as I've seen it so far, is still kind of in progress. But my prediction is another year or two, you could probably have a very keen volunteer who wanted to learn about the podcast, who could fire your episodes into a machine like that and create transcripts that would be searchable.
Yeah, if someone is interested, do send me an email. I mean, I did try I had a team of volunteers a couple years ago that I was trying. And every person did great work and was really helpful. But I found, unfortunately, that for me, it took an element of my creativity out of it, which I wasn't satisfied with. And also, obviously, managing a team of 5 people is suddenly more work than just doing it yourself sometimes. So that was a challenge, which I kind of faced with that. But I still do have an editor who is editing the shows behind the scenes. That is a serious time saver for me. And I find sometimes a second set of ears is doing a better job than I would have just done, because maybe I didn't realize how monotonous a certain part of a conversation was. And I've given him pretty strict instructions now, actually, to be more harsh with the editing, in the sense that, like, I tend to babble sometimes, as you might notice. And there's times when it's just, if I'm talking to some great artist and I go on a diversion about, like, my favorite type of ice cream, it's just not relevant. I don't know. Maybe some people would find it interesting, but I don't think it deserves to be on the podcast. So that kind of stuff tends to get left on the cutting room floor.
That's awesome. Here's your next question that's come in from people who are listening. And if you have questions, please put them in the question and answer box. Tom is asking, have you ever interviewed Donald L. Oler, professor of clarinet at University of North Carolina?
No,
Okay.
I have not. But if you want to send me a guest recommendation, it always helps if you actually know that person, can include their email with the message. Just kind of takes some of the legwork out of it, because I don't oftentimes know where to start when someone might request some guests, but I mean, unless you know their agent or their email address or something, it's oftentimes kind of hard to get in touch. So if you do know that person, you want to hear from them, though, I would be happy to take that as a recommendation.
Excellent. I'm just kind of going in the order these are coming in. Yeah. Shane is saying, what's the Lumiere Clarinet like? And then he's observed that you have 2.03K subscribers on YouTube at present. So maybe talk about the Lumiere Clarinet and then tell us a bit about your YouTube channel.
Yeah, okay. So Lumiere Clarinet's been great. I mean, when I first started working at Bakun, I had a protege, and I've since upgraded to this. And actually, this is the Cocobolo wood, so I don't know if you can see that, but it's kind of a reddish material. And then this instrument has the gold keys, which I like. I'm kind of a sucker for it just looking really cool. And some of the extra key vents and levers and things like that. So this instrument has been really amazing. And one of the things about it that I like is that just versus other clarinets I've played in the past, the intonation seems great, the articulation's excellent, the response of the keys and everything about it is just, it feels perfect all the time. And even after a year of playing it, I remember I went and visited with Maury, and I said, look, I mean, I just want to make sure it's still in good shape. And he checked it, and it was still basically in as great a condition as when I first played it. So that it seems to be holding up really well as well. As far as concerns about cracking and stuff where I live, it is always a concern. I live in really dry climate, so I didn't worry about which wood, because I was like, well, it doesn't matter. If it's gonna crack, it's gonna crack where I live. So, I have posted a couple of videos where I'm playing it now on YouTube. I did an unboxing, and I think about 20,000 people watched it. And the funny thing about that unboxing video is I said that I was going to play it shortly after I did the video, and then it just fell off my list of priorities to post another YouTube video for like 2 years. And I don't know if I've even still really done a proper video playing it, but I'll do something soon, because I do have some more content planned. But the YouTube channel, so what maybe that person's asking about that is I have taken an effort to try and start up some more fun, short kind of YouTube videos that are really unrelated to the podcast. Oh yeah, Randy says I was sick. That's right. I had a really bad flu or something, like for a month or two after that. Anyhow, but on the YouTube channel, I actually have a giveaway that I'm going to be unboxing at 2,500 subscribers and giving away at 10,000. But it's actually, I don't have it here, it's in my closet, but it's a clarinet sized box, and you can imagine what might be inside that box, but it's from Bakun. So if you do want a chance to win a secret clarinet from Bakun, then you can check that out. I'll unbox it at 2,500 subscribers and give it away. So I'm just trying to grow my YouTube presence. I think that YouTube is a great medium. I'd love to have a bigger following on there to try and just influence in a new way. That's one thing about the podcast for me, which has been hard but yet interesting at the same time, is adapting as technology changes. You know, I felt like I learned so much just to podcast, and now there's this YouTube thing which is becoming even more popular, and I need to kind of learn something new and get into a new realm. So, but I guess what fun is life if you stop learning, right?
That's great. All right, next question. And I think this might be alluding back to the session we had a few days ago where you were adding into some questions when I was the special guest. Our chairs were reversed, and Randy says, Sean, do you have a book of analogies, or did they just pop into your head? We were calling you the analogy guy.
Yeah, you know, I have a lot of different analogies for teaching. You know, so one of the things that maybe people watching or even people listening to the podcast don't realize is, like, when I say I've done some teaching, like, I've actually taught more than 1,000 beginner clarinet workshops for schools in and around, like probably at least 100 to 200 sessions a year for about 10 to 15 years. So that's a lot of sessions. And those can be anywhere from 30 minutes to, well, that'd be pretty rare. I guess usually about an hour to well over 6 and 8 hours sometimes. So, like, amazingly, some of the work I was doing when I was younger was like, you would get up in the morning at 6 a.m. and you drive out to some, they call them camps outside the city. They're like really recreational retreats, and the kids would all be there. And you're basically brought out for the day to work with the kids on their clarinet music. And you got a group of grade 7 kids, and you're with them from 8 till 12 and 1 till 5. There's a lot of time to kill. So you learn kind of to come up with fun stories and to make things more interesting and not always make it so kind of serious about the music. And I guess one thing maybe I'm just kind of good at is coming up with different ways to explain things. I find that as a teacher, one thing that can be helpful is to sometimes address something from several perspectives, even at the same time. And you almost do it rapid fire, because different people will pick up on it in different ways. And so I think it's just really helpful to be able to come up with ideas on how to describe something that are not based in clarinet. Because if you're trying to teach someone clarinet, using the clarinet as an example of what to do is not really a good idea, right? Because that's what they're trying to learn about. So if I say to, I'm trying to think of an example. I think I was talking about tonguing, and you were saying to continue the airstream steadily. And so I have this analogy about like the what's it called? The sprinkler, right? So the sprinkler at the end there, that's your tongue, and then the water pressure is your lungs. And immediately that makes sense to a lot of people. And then they stop doing that whole owl tonguing thing, you know? And so I find that things like that are just really helpful. And they get to the bottom of something in a very relatable, non-musical way that suddenly just kind of clicks. And I sort of, I don't want to say that I focus on that, but I do have a lot of kind of things in my bag, so to speak, that I could talk to a group of grade 7 kids or whatever, how old they are, and based on the level, I have different kind of questions and analogies to ask them. But I mean, I could easily talk to someone for 5 hours nonstop in a clarinet section, because I've done it hundreds of times. It's just something that I'm very used to, right? So yeah, I come up with many different analogies. I have all kinds of ones that I've worked with, and you know what? Maybe not everyone likes all of them, but that's just my perspective on that. And I used to really worry about, like, oh, well, what if some great player heard me and had a different perspective? And then later I realized that's great. Maybe it's great that the next clinician says something different. And if my idea didn't work for you, then oh well, that's the way it goes.
I imagine that experience helps you on the podcast too, because when you're interviewing a great teacher, you have the ability to draw out of them some of their good teaching pointers and things that are going to help the average clarinetist who's listening to the podcast.
Yeah, I think that's one thing I could do better, is appeal more to a more amateur audience. But I've always tried to avoid being too amateur, like, because I think that one of the things that is nice about the podcast is if you're a beginner listening, it'll help you kind of grow musically instead of sort of stay where you are. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but if you're here and the conversation is kind of up here and above, you're going to pull yourself up to that level. It's maybe not good to just stay down here and talk about what kind of reeds people use and the rose studies for your whole life. I mean, there's a lot of other music out there, a lot of other things to do. If you can elevate some of these concepts, and I think that if there's one real takeaway from the podcast for me, it has been that what's most interesting to most musicians is all the stuff that's not of interest really to amateur players and beginners. Like I remember when I got Martin Frost on, for example, I asked for listener questions to come in, and 99.995% of them were people asking, oh, what strength of reed does he play on, and blah, 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 blah. And I just thought to myself, like, I can't ask these questions. Like, and as I discussed with these people too, I find that they're not interested in those questions. They want to talk about music. And looking back, like, let's say you can reflect on the Clarinet interview 30 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. It becomes kind of an archival thing about a conversation about Martin Frost. You want to talk about things that mattered. What was interesting to that person artistically or musically, or so I prefer to try and elevate the conversation and then leave the other things to other people. There's a lot of people who discuss beginner clarinet gear and all that kind of stuff. So even though I have a lot to say about it, I'm not going to ask our world's greatest artists about those kind of things. And that's just my perspective, I guess. Here's
kind of a question and a comment from Jim. He says,
no comments. No, I'm kidding.
He says, jazz sax player Chris Potter plays bass clarinet. He said, now on the following tune he played tenor, but did you ever hear his version of Radiohead's Morning Bell?
Oh God, no. Radiohead Morning Bell is one of my favorite songs, actually. I will have to check that out. And you know what? I would love to get him not only on my Clarinet podcast. If he plays bass clarinet, he is then welcome. But I'd love to get him on because he's a great player, very famous too. And I could do a double whammy because I also have a show about Radiohead, which he'd make an excellent guest for. So I'm going to look into that, and you might see an episode coming out with him soon. That'd be really interesting. As an interesting side note, I actually have talked to one of the saxophonists who performed on Radiohead's Kid A. So that was a really interesting conversation. I ended up sharing that on the podcast. And recently, actually, I was in Vancouver and I went to see a show with Tom York, and he signed, that's the lead singer, he's actually signed my copy and I got to meet him, which was kind of a life goal for me. So I don't want to turn into a huge fanboy here, but that was pretty cool. And I definitely will check out the version of Morning Bell, which is it's an interesting song if you're new to Radiohead. It's in 5/4 time, but there's a second version of that song which appears on their next album, which is totally different character in 4/4 time. So it's one of the only instances I can think of a band releasing two versions of the same song on subsequent albums. I'm not really sure why they did that. I think it somehow ties the two together. And interestingly, they've never played the second version live at all. They've just stuck to the first one. So I'm assuming that's the one Chris Potter did. But anyways, I'm like a Radiohead encyclopedia, so we should stop.
Well, there you have yet more new information to follow up on. There's also just some nice comments here. Linda from New Zealand saying she was in a really bad car accident and is now trying to get back into clarinet playing and finds that you're very inspirational to her. So I think your story
I
also...
wish you luck. It's really hard. It's really hard. For sometimes, especially like at the beginning, when you first try to get back into it, it can be very emotional.
Mm-hmm. So. Kristen's asking, do you aim for a regular publishing time, like twice a month or once a week? What's your schedule like?
I've been aiming for once a week for 5 years. It's so hard. The worst part about it is I hate when I have pre-recorded content that's not released. Because like right now I have, I think, close to 20 episodes, if not 20, that are pre-recorded and just waiting. And I need to get them out. But unfortunately, everyone takes a long time. Like it's got to get sent to my editor. I've got to record the intros and outros. And if I actually added up all the steps it takes to release one episode, it's probably in over 1,000. Like all the little things that drive me nuts too. Like I got to go to the website and create the show notes page and copy the track player in and add the intro and outro and create the second Patreon version for the other listeners. And there's like hundreds and hundreds of steps, and it's very tedious. So each show ends up taking at least 10, 20 hours of work, not accounting for the actual preparation. And this is one of the reasons that, I've caught some flack for this, but I ended up seeking sponsorship and Patreon support, which is a crowdfunding method. And the God honest truth is that there's been many times, especially in the past, where I would give up playing work or teaching work to talk to an artist to put out a podcast episode. And it takes a lot of time and effort and resources. And for the work that I don't do and I start doing the podcast, I wanted to try and make that support me and my family somehow as well. Especially after 5 years, it became very difficult to justify continuing to do something without those kind of situations. So I have no problem with the situation as it is now. It's been excellent, but that wasn't always the case. And so the long story short is that I'd love to release 48 episodes a year. That's what I schedule for. That's what I currently have my year goal set for. But it's a ways from that. Even though I'm technically caught up behind the scenes, people just don't know that. But I know there's been many gaps. And one of those gaps was at the beginning when I hurt my hand. And I've had several horrible flus and sinus infections over the last couple of years. It seems like every time I'm ready to go with a bunch more episodes, I get knocked down a bit. But such is life. And it's definitely been more difficult having a daughter, that is for sure. She's a very busy girl and keeps me on my toes. So, but it's great.
I want to go back to your Patreon comment, because I don't think people realize the extent of what you just said, that each of those episodes takes you about 20 hours of your time. That's a huge amount of time, and you're receiving very little monetization for what you do. And yet it's this great gift to the clarinet world. As you say, some of this stuff people might be accessing 50 years from now, 100 years ago. What was Martin Frost like? And it'll be one of the few documented interviews of him. I mean, he has other ones out there. But just for people who don't know what Patreon is, my understanding is it's very flexible for people to just say, hey, this is worth supporting, and they can make a one-time donation, or they can be a monthly sponsor, $5 a month or $20 a month. And can you just talk a bit about how you've structured it so that there are some bonuses if people do become a Patreon subscriber?
Yeah, so I've structured Clarineat in two ways. So the first way is you can listen completely for free if you want. There's no problem with that. In fact, I support that because I think that many people just want to listen, and that's fine. However, you're going to get episodes with ads in them, and I think that's a reasonable trade-off. I had someone recently kind of criticizing me about this, and I was like, look, man, I mean, this is how the world works. You turn on your TV, you turn on anything, there's ads. If it's free, you're paying for it somehow. So the ads, I also make sure, are super relevant. Like, we've got excellent sponsors who care greatly about the growth of the Clarineat brand and having their artists take part and interacting with me and providing opportunities for new platforms. I only want to work with people like that, right? So the current sponsors are Lumiere Reeds, which I can't imagine a more relevant product. I mean, I've played them since I was a kid, and they're super supportive, and many artists play them now. And like, what more of a niche product could you ask for? So, and the other big sponsor is Bakun. They have been just excellent, and I've had the chance to talk to a lot of their artists. It's been really wonderful. And so again, how could you get more relevant than a clarinet brand? So I'm not making people listen through a bunch of conversation about, hey, sign up for Audible and get a free ebook or whatever. I've tried to really tailor it and develop really good relationships with the advertisers. So that's the effort that I put in. And then just if you want to listen for free, that's totally fine. But there's going to be some advertisements, right? Now, the only thing is you won't get access to the extended, what I call lightning round version of the episode. And that's kind of just some bonus casual chat that I have with the person. I'll ask them what their first musical memory was. I'll ask them about their favorite book, their favorite CD, what kind of car they wish they had, just little fun things at the end for about 10, 15 minutes. And so for as little as $1 a month, you get access to an ad-free extended episode of the show on Patreon. So I think that's a reasonable trade-off. I don't want it, I've set it to $1, and some people think that's too low. But the honest reason for that is because I don't want there to be any excuse for someone not to be able to get that extended episode. And I know that most people go for the $1 version just because it's the cheapest, and oh well, so what. But honestly, like, I know that there's no person really on this earth that probably can't afford $1 a month. I mean, if you're having a latte once a month, maybe just don't add the extra cream or whatever, and there it is, right? And if there was some situation where someone was so desperate that they really, quite honestly, couldn't afford the extra $1, I would probably just find a way to send them a feed so they could listen to the bonus content. But I think it's a good trade-off for a very nominal fee. you can get access to, 15 minutes extra content on most episodes and not have to listen to the ads. So yeah, if you're listening and you feel like you don't want to have the ads anymore, then you're welcome to do that for a very nominal fee. So you can also make a donation on the website if you want. And actually, maybe I'll just mention this because why not? I'm actually launching a fun clarinet website for shirts. I designed a bunch of clarinet shirts. And so coming soon, not yet, but you can go to clarinetshirts.com and there's going to be some really hilarious spoof t-shirts. And we've got about 25 designs, which I've somehow found the time to make and upload there. So it'll be launched soon after this whole pandemic is over. It was supposed to launch in March, but that didn't work.
We can definitely put a link to that in the show notes. And there's some people just saying, how do we find the podcast? So Clarineat.com, correct?
Clarineat.com. You can search Clarineat on any podcast player. That's the best way, though. It's probably the website, and that'll give you links. There's a little tab up at the top that says, I think it says subscribe, and you can click your platform from there and load it right to your device. You can also leaf through the website, but I recently did a big update, and about 2/3 of the episodes, the players broke, unfortunately. So I need to go through and update like 200 pages with new players. So the best way, honestly, is probably just to go to Clarineat.com and then click on the subscribe link so you can pull it up in your device. And it's a podcast. You're probably going to listen to it most often on your iPhone or something anyway. So you might as well do it that way. If you do decide to load up some episodes, though, do me a huge favor and click subscribe, especially on YouTube. I need to get my YouTube watch hours up. So go on YouTube, subscribe, leave it running overnight. That'd be great. Leave it running while you sleep. I can really put you to sleep well, maybe. But subscribe there. And if you can, leave a review. It's always fun to see what people think or have comments or things like that. It's nice to see. And I do see most of them eventually. So.
I think often as consumers of content, whether we're listening to a podcast or going to YouTube to search for information, we don't realize that one of the ways we can support the artists who are giving their content away is to subscribe to their YouTube channels and put comments there, because YouTube will favor videos that get a lot of reaction and engagement from viewers. So clicking like is good, but even if you just take the time to write, wow, really enjoyed this, or ask a question, then YouTube kind of thinks, wow, this video is more interesting to people, and they're going to introduce it to other listeners. And so I think if you can go to Sean's YouTube channel and engage in his videos, that will help more people discover what he has to offer.
So another way, sorry, I just thought of this. I noticed I'm getting a lot of notifications right now. I thought maybe something was wrong upstairs with my wife, but I realized it's people subscribing to my newsletter. So another way you can get access is if you go to the Clarinet homepage, there's a big box right there. It says email address. If you put your email address, I'll then be sending you the episodes when they're released to your email. So you can load them up on your podcast player that way. Some people prefer that. Some people are sick of receiving more emails. I get that too. So there's a lot of different ways, but any of the players on the devices or the website are probably the best way.
That sounds great. Here's just a comment from someone. Susan says, Sean, I thought of you when I heard the U.S. Army Field Band Clarinet Quartet perform Creep from Radiohead. I remember hearing you mention Radiohead online. The Field Band Clarinet Quartet was amazing, and I got chills listening to them perform Creep.
Oh, cool. Yeah, no, I watched that live, and I can't remember the guy's name, but he had sent me an email letting me know that was happening, and he wanted me to share it on the podcast, but I think I ended up just sharing it on social media because it was too soon. But yeah, it was really cool. Nice to hear other people tuned into that.
So anytime someone hears clarinet and Radiohead in the same sentence, you clearly pop into their minds.
Yes, I guess so.
Which is great.
There actually was a clarinet player on a Radiohead album one time. His name is Jim. Oh my God, I can't remember right now. He teaches at a school in New York, in London. I've just never been able to get him on the show. So if you know that guy, put him in touch with me. That'd be great.
That's great. Put it out there. Somebody watching this, either live or on replay, might know Jim, who played with Radiohead. And I bet he'd love to be on your podcast. All right, next question. Randy's asking any teasers for us of those who you have for upcoming podcasts.
Oh, yeah, okay. Let me think here. Who's coming up? So Oh, there's a lot of episodes. So there's one lady named Angela Beeching. There's two coming up with her. She's the author of a book called Beyond Talent. And this is another funny story because I remember hearing a lot of guests suggest this book. And then one day she emailed me saying she wanted to be on the podcast. And I'd never bothered to read it yet. And I was like, oh, wow. So she sent me a promo copy. I read the book and we had a chat. Really, really nice lady. And I love her take on a lot of this stuff. Becoming a successful musician is about much more than just practicing. And she goes into a lot of the ways that's the case. Who else is coming up? Cornell Volak. Man, we talked months ago. I feel bad. He just released a book and about embouchure development. And so we have a conversation coming out. There's a couple more conversations with a guy named Stephen P. Brown, who runs another music podcast, and he's a music business coach. So again, I tend to go into the weeds a bit sometimes and talk to interesting people like that. Who else is coming up? There are more, but they escape me right now. I'd have to pull up my list of upcoming episodes.
One of the things I love is that you do branch off into so many different areas. And as you say, with so many episodes there, people can really tune into the ones that they feel are most relevant. But I think sometimes be open too. You've done a great job of interviewing authors of books that are helpful to musicians at any level. And there's apps that are useful to musicians, maybe things that people aren't even aware of, and they can use your podcast as a chance to discover these resources.
Yeah, the app I think you're referring to is called Modacity. It's actually really cool. And it's interesting to talk to the hosts sometimes or the developers of other things that are kind of unrelated, and especially non-clarinet players. What fun would it be to never hear any different perspectives, right? So talking to a horn player who's developed an app is kind of cool. I mean, it's relevant to clarinet players in some way, if at least just for additional knowledge, right?
Sean, someone's referring back to what you just talked about, the author of Beyond Talent. Can you just repeat her name, and we'll put that in the resources list?
Angela Beeching. And someone has said Jimmy Hastings. That's right. That guy's name is Jimmy Hastings. And I have contacted him on several occasions and have not heard back. So either he's not interested or he's retired or very old. I'm not sure. But he performed on a track called Life in a Glass House, in kind of a New Orleans style jazz song. So anyways, interesting player. Would be nice to talk to him, but I'm not sure if that one will happen.
Anyone here who's friends with Jimmy Hastings, get in touch with Sean.
Totally.
All right. Sean, in spite of you saying earlier that you like to get more to the heart of what's interesting, there are people asking questions about your clarinets and gear and such. Are you willing to go there and answer some gear questions?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So someone's asking, what's your opinion on flavor reeds?
I remember, it's funny because I remember when I was a kid, I hated the taste of reeds, and I first found out that flavor reeds existed when I was like 12. And I remember thinking, oh man, I'm definitely going to use those. That's such an amazing idea. And I still have yet to try them. But I had the chance to meet the creator at Midwest Clinic a couple of years ago. He's a really old man. I hope he's still alive. He's very old. He could barely hear at the time actually, but he's just a really nice old man. And I asked him, why did you come up with this? And he just said, I wanted music to be fun. And I thought that was such an honest, good reason. And I know that a lot of people will, I don't want to swear here, but they will crap all over those kind of products. But you know what? If something brings fun and interest and enjoyment to someone, especially while they're young and learning, I mean, there's really nothing wrong with that. And I think that obviously those products are not really used by professionals unless they have like a whiskey or bourbon flavor. But but I definitely think it has a place. It's a fun product, and it may not be the best reed in the world. I've actually never played them, but I like the story and I like the guy behind it. I thought it was a cool idea. So, I mean, in the name of fun, yeah, I think it's great, but I've never played on them. I don't know anyone who has.
Coming soon, the Clarinet whiskey flavored reeds.
Oh, yeah. I joked one time that I'd like reed flavored reeds because I love the taste of reed, and I wish that taste would continue.
All right. Someone's asking, what's the difference in sound between Kookaburra and Grenadilla wood bells, and what is a voicing groove?
Well, Richard, I think I was supposed to give you a call today. I was going to give you a show back tomorrow, but I'll answer it here. So the differences between all these things, I mean, I think that in some way that's rather subjective. But me and many other people, I think, would say normally that grenadilla wood tends to be a little bit, I don't want to say brighter, but maybe more brilliant and more projecting of a wood. And that's also the typical kind of clarinet wood that exists, right? It's popular because it's very dense, it's very hard, it looks dark in color. It's kind of your classic clarinet look. The cocobolo has always been interesting to me, not just because I like things that look interesting, but I do like the darker sound that it produces. It's slightly less dense, so that has a couple different benefits outside of the appearance, and that is one of them being the weight. So it's slightly less weight, and but many people I think would describe that it doesn't project quite as well as the grenadilla. So it might be better suited to like chamber music playing instead of, for example, an orchestra. But again, that being said, there are numerous players who use cocobolo in an orchestra every day. So it comes down to trying to make your personal kind of profile of what you're looking for is in an instrument. So a voicing groove, I hope that answers the first part of the question. Do you think I missed anything, Michelle?
No, I think that's a good distinction there. And again, as you said, it's very subjective. Different players will play it and just like the sound they make on that particular wood.
Yeah, totally. And so the voicing groove, if you look inside, I don't know if you're going to see this on there, but Bakun products, and I don't know how many other manufacturers do this, but they have one and sometimes even two voicing grooves on the inside. And basically what that means is it's a little kind of literally a groove. If you put your finger in the end of the bell, you can feel kind of an impression all the way around the edge. And I don't know the exact physics of it, but what this helps you to do is to get over the register changes more smoothly and any other kind of big leaps on the instrument. And again, I don't really know how that works, but that is that's the idea. I guess it was such a good idea that they doubled it up and put two on the Lumiere barrel instead of just one. Interestingly, a lot of Bakun products were available with, and I speak about Bakun obviously because I work there and know the most about it. I have no idea about some of the other brands right now, so I just speak for that. But I'd say like 99% of people order the product with the voicing groove. It's kind of hard to imagine why someone would not want it. So it used to be offered in both with and without, but now they're pretty much just offering them with all the time. It's not, sorry, Pablo, it's not a bump. It's like basically a little ring that's hollowed out. If you can imagine, try to come up with an analogy here, I guess. But it's kind of like a little gutter that runs the edge of the entire circle of the inside of the not the barrel, the bell, right?
If it was ice cream, it's like running your finger through it and leaving a hole there.
I like that.
Something soft or chocolate icing on a cake. That's what it looks like, Pablo. Is like someone's taken their finger and made a little hole in it along the edge of it.
Yeah, it's not something you'll see when you look at it unless you like really get inside with a light. But it's an advertised feature just because it does change the characteristic of how it plays.
And you know, we had Maury Bakun as a guest a couple of nights ago, and he actually talked about that. And he mentioned there are a couple, brands, mostly the higher end clarinet brands that are doing experimenting with those voicing grooves. And he said the same thing. It especially affects the ability to move between registers smoothly and create more evenness. It's a nice invention.
That you don't know that you need until you have it. Then after you have it, you kind of can't go back. And I remember that the bell is so interesting because I remember when I first played, and this is not like an ad for Bakun, but when I first played Bakun bells years ago, I thought to myself, there's no way the bell is going to make that big of a difference. And then I put one on and I played and I was like, oh my God, I don't know how, but I'm done asking questions. I'll just leave it be and let it kind of happen, And people a lot of times are very skeptical of the bell. And I get that because it's so far down the instrument. It's also much more expensive. And to be quite honest, if you think about why it would be more expensive, it's because a bell takes up about the space of what could make 4 barrels, right? So when you buy a bell, you're really buying 4 barrels that didn't become barrels, they became a bell instead, right? So it's a lot more wood and a lot different kind of effort, right? Also, it has to be a piece of wood that is completely free of imperfections throughout that entire space. So maybe with another type of wood or a piece, you can still get a barrel out of the corner and then you discard the other pieces, but that can't happen with the bell, right? So anyway, and if it didn't matter the material too, I mean, you could make a bell out of Swiss cheese and get along just fine. But But as has been shown by people spending a lot of money on various upgraded equipment, it does make a difference. And I think that if it didn't make a difference, honestly, I don't think people would buy the stuff. So there's no reason to spend hundreds and thousands of dollars on equipment that doesn't do anything. So I think that when you try these kind of things, you got to be open-minded, experience different products, different variants of those, try the different woods if you can, make your own conclusions, I guess is kind of what I'm saying. But do recognize sometimes now, and this is nothing against anybody, but it's something that I often explain to my younger students. There are times where you're not yet ready to experience the difference that something like that might make. Like I like to play guitar. I don't know I think someone asked if I play the basses in the background. Yeah, I play bass, but I'm not going to notice the difference between a $10,000 bass and a $500 bass. It's not where I'm at with bass, So that might be a situation that you experience with clarinet as well. Is that, are there things that might be good to upgrade? Yeah. Are you going to notice the difference between a $3,000 clarinet and a $20,000 clarinet? Well, maybe you're not ready, and that's okay. But it's something to be mindful of when you try this gear and you go, oh, that doesn't make a difference, right? For some very, very refined artists, that last little bit of finesse might be the little bit that they need to get to where they perform with, right?
I think that's great wisdom, Sean. I often say to people, mouthpieces should be one of the first things they explore, because that makes a difference for relatively inexperienced players. But the bell, they might not notice until they're really doing big leaps into the altissimo on a regular basis. But I was like you, I looked at the bell and I thought, it's just that thing at the end, it's not really going to make much difference. And I was shocked at how much it influences the sound.
A great way to tell if the bell matters is to take off your bell and try to play.
That's true.
You'll learn real fast that it's pretty important for more than just long B.
There are a couple people, both Janet and Pablo, and I actually think they're asking about the same thing. The low vent mechanism key you have on your Lumiere and
okay.
What it does, if you would be willing to show that to us.
So the Lumiere has a couple special features. One of them being, this is the left-hand E flat lever. So a lot of clarinets have your basic kind of stack of keys, and then on this side they have four, I don't know if you can see that. There's 4 touch pieces here, but then on this side, they'll only really have 3, right? Now this instrument and most modern instruments, I wish all instruments have added now, you can play the E flat or the G sharp on the other side as well, right? So that's really convenient for modern music, and just depending on the pattern. And I never did like sliding, and in fact these system of clarinets aren't really designed for sliding. A lot of people do slide, but I mean it's kind of a fakery, right? There's no rollers here. It's not designed for that. It's designed with the multiple options. So there's the left-hand E flat lever. I find that's only advantages, but one disadvantage might be that it adds weight to the instrument, but I mean, it's fairly negligible, so I would definitely take that with a grain of salt. And some people say that they hit it by mistake, and to me, that's just, what other keys do you hit by mistake that you can rightly dismiss? I think that's a really bad reason to not like that key, but I think it's a very nice key to have, and I'd highly recommend it to anybody. It comes standard. I see a question. This is a Lumiere by Bakun. And then the other interesting key that this instrument has is called the low F vent mechanism. So I'm not a physicist or whatever, but one of the problems with the clarinet, as I understand it, is that it's actually impossible to design a perfect clarinet, and we need to accommodate a lot with our face and our voicing to produce an entire register or scale of notes that are in tune, right? So if you don't do anything with your voicing and your face, your F major scale, 3 octaves, is going to be all over the place. It's not going to be very correct in a lot of ways. And so there's compromises built into the instrument. And one of those compromises tends to be that on most clarinets, the low F is a very flat note. And now this note is so flat generally that what ends up happening is you have to lip it up a long way, and it really makes it difficult to play fast passages in tune, for example. And the other thing is that when you're down that low, it is harder to lip up than when you're up higher, just because of the way that the vibrations are working. The higher speed vibrations are easier to change a large amount than the lower ones, right? So anyways, this key, basically what it does, it's an automatic key. So if you play the low F, what it does is it's leaving this open, it's venting. It's called the low F vent mechanism, right? So that's open right now. But if I press down the low E, it closes, right? So when you play F, this pad is closed. The sound is normally coming out here, but with the low F vent mechanism, a little bit of it is venting over here, a little bit higher up the tube, which lets it be in tune, which is really nice, obviously. And that is really the only time it's engaged is that one note, right? So if I'm playing any other note, it's just sitting there, and then on the low E, it needs to close because obviously the tube has to be closed all that way down. But even on the upper register, the upper register, it stays shut, I guess. That's just how it works. But it's a little tough to play with at first because it introduces a second bridge mechanism which runs down the entire instrument just for that one note, right? And if you're not super accurate with your thumb key, you'll find it to be quite annoying at first, as I did. I had no idea how, I don't know if you had this experience, Michelle, I guess I'd be interested to know, but when I first switched to the custom clarinet, I was like, oh man, I'm having some issues. And I realized I wasn't quite depressing the key in a way that was allowing this register mechanism to close. So, you know, this is any part of adjusting to a new horn, but for me, that was a weird one, is just realizing how the severe level of accuracy needed to go up just a little bit to make sure that key would function effectively all the time. I think a guy named Tom Kowalski talked about this on episode 2 of the podcast. He was playing something called the Yamaha EY or EWI or something. It's a digital instrument, and it made his fingers a lot more accurate because there's no room for error. Like the computer doesn't accept even the slightest wrong input. So anyway, yeah, that's the kind of an introduction to some of the special features on there. And I think that's about it. Like the trill keys are kind of interestingly designed. We could go into that, like I said, a long time, but those are the basic 2 keys that people are probably asking about.
I think we're really lucky to live in an age where there are some wonderful clarinet craftsmen and people who are adding new designs to it. The idea of taking a note that's been out of tune for decades and figuring out how to fix it. And I see, if we look at all the main clarinet manufacturers, they're continuing to add innovations like that. So we're very lucky to have that to us, and I think it's thanks to innovators, people like Maury Bakun, who just sit and aren't satisfied with the status quo and want to keep finding ways to make it better for us.
Totally.
Yeah, we're very lucky. Sean, this has been so interesting, and I think for everyone, you've definitely increased their intrigue about the Clarineat podcast. If they've never experienced it, I really encourage people to go out and listen, pick your favorite episodes, or just start somewhere in the last year, as Sean recommends, but they're all good. Even back when he was just starting off, they're still very interesting. I want to just also let people know about what's coming up next here on Clarinet Connections. My original vision was we would have an artist every day. As it turns out, just with people's schedules, there's a couple days where we have 2 artists and a couple days where we have nothing. So tomorrow is a day off, and your homework for tomorrow is to listen to a couple of Clarineat podcast episodes so that you're still enriching yourself with clarinet knowledge. 2 days from now, at the same time we started tonight, 5 p.m. Pacific, our guest will be David Griffiths, who's an Australian clarinetist from Melbourne, and his wife Svetlana, who is a cellist. They have an amazing trio they play with clarinet, cello, and piano. He's written all kinds of music. And he's also offered to just answer clarinet questions, educational questions. So any challenges you're having with your clarinet, David's going to take some time just to answer your questions, and he's a wonderful teacher. So that's kind of what's coming up. Sean, I want to thank you not only for everything you do with Clarineat podcasts, but all of your participation so far here in the Clarinet Connections. You're just a wonderful, engaging host, and it was fun for me when you interviewed me, and it was fun for me to interview you, and I look forward to doing more fun things with you.
Absolutely. We're both Canadian too, so we got to spread that clarinet Canadian around the world. Do you mind if I want to take a snapshot here for social media? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
I don't have all the audience here, but let's do a 1, 2, 3 cheese flavored reeds.
Everybody wave. All 89 people who are still watching, let's all wave.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, great turnout. This is great. Almost 100. I think it was over 100 people at one point. I'm not sure about Facebook, but thank you everybody, and do check out clarineat.com. And if you're here from Clarineat, I don't know who might be here from that, but do check out Michelle's website too. She's got a lot of great stuff on there. beginner lessons and the Clarinet Mentors community and all that stuff. So if you're here from another platform or from Clarinet or Bakun or somewhere else, make sure to check out Michelle's content if you're not familiar with it as well.
All right. Thanks so much, Sean. And thanks to all of you who are tuning in. We'll look forward to seeing you on our next broadcast. All right. Bye, everybody.